All right, so this is part 2 of the mini-series on the Androgyne. I just, a few moments ago, uploaded the first part of this mini-series, so make sure, if you're seeing this and you haven't seen that, to go back to part 13 overall in the series. My contention, the more I ponder and study both the topics that I've already talked about and things that I'm covering now and will be hopefully covering in the future, it looks to me as though it's clear to me, it may not be clear to everyone out there, but it's very clear to me that in spite of the existence of some very lofty concepts in theology, philosophy, and metaphysics regarding God or the spiritual in general, ultimately, in one form or another, virtually all of these religions, with maybe the possible exception of Sikhism, I'd have to look into that a little bit more. Yeah, I'd say with the I would say with the exception of Sikhism, almost everyone either is doing it knowingly or unknowingly. So they're not all doing it knowingly. That would include the Abrahamic faiths. Everyone is ultimately worshiping an alien or an extraterrestrial. So they took these beings as gods when they were here, when they first came here. Actually, they came here many times. Only if you take a young earth creation Christian fundamentalist view would you think they only came once at around the time of the flood, or just prior to the flood. Or I guess they think twice, because I guess they show up again after the flood, so some Christians think some of them returned, or maybe some of them survived the flood. But they were responsible for helping us develop a society, to develop civilization. They helped us develop our politics. We get much of our early the earliest religions, I would say, are in large part manifestations of what was handed down to us by these entities. And in many instances, if not most or all of those instances, the primary god or gods of the pantheon were members of the what we would call in Sumerian the Anunnaki, or in Hebrew the Elohim, or Olympians and Titans if you go with the Greek. So in my mind, these aren't true deities. These are simply extremely advanced relative to ourselves entities within the surrounding cosmos, who are interdimensional in nature, but can take on physicality and have interacted with us, with our ancient ancestry, that way as physical entities. And so a lot of the systems of blood sacrifice, human sacrifice, and animal sacrifice are based on a misdirected reverence for these beings. Now, I'm not suggesting that none of them had good intentions or well-meaning intentions towards us. But the beings that we had the most interaction with were those who were running whatever program they were running. And so they would have been the elite of their race. So they are coming here with a particular agenda, and there are rivalries among them. We know this from ancient history. We know this from Greek mythology and from Sumerian mythology, from mythologies that long predate the Hebrew story, which is simply riffing from the Sumerian and Akkadian and so on, and just drastically modifying the story, altering it. And I would submit that the Hebrews did this with Egyptian mythology as well, which I'll be talking about in another series, where I get into the sacrifice of Cain and Abel and so on, but where I believe that comes from. So I believe that the Androgyne idea or concept is not something that we should embrace, and is most likely a teaching that was handed down to us by the Anunnaki themselves, and or it is a myth that we developed that came out of a real experience in our history, and it was mistaken or misinterpreted. So, or over time, it became misinterpreted. Because there is evidence to suggest from the Sumerian texts, numerous people who have studied the Sumerian texts have brought this up, so I'm not making this up. They have pointed out that the original engineered human beings, meaning us, who were genetically engineered by these higher, I'm calling them higher Anunnaki. We are the lower Anunnaki because we actually descend from them. We descend from them and from the apes. So we're kind of a combination of animal and also higher dimensional, the higher dimensional beings we call the Anunnaki or the Elohim. So we have that interesting mix. I lost my train of thought. So, where was I? Anyway, right, the Androgyne. So these scholars point out from the texts that when they engineered us, they created initially an androgyne. We were androgynes, and because they needed a labor force. They didn't want to do the work, so they created us to do the work. And they wanted a certain number of us, but they didn't want our number to get out of control. So they did not initially create us or engineer us to procreate. But the chief engineer over this project, the chief geneticist, if you will, who in the story is Enki, the brother of Enlil, who is really best represented in the Hebrew story by Yahweh, by Hebrew ancient Hebrew mythology by Yahweh, Enki would correspond to, in the Hebrew story, to the snake in the garden. He wanted man to have knowledge that the divine council wasn't interested in our having, because all we were good for was labor. And he also wanted to give us the ability to procreate, and he wanted us to have the ability to evolve and develop and have the kind of intelligence that would enable us to do that, to become like the quote-unquote gods with a lower G, to become like them. And Enki aroused the anger of the divine council. I don't know that he was the only, I don't remember the details from the story, if he was the only person who thought we should have this knowledge and this ability to procreate, but he was certainly very much in a minority, and he did this on his own. He did not do this with the backing or the authority of the council. And so Enki in the Sumerian story tends to be associated with Prometheus from the Greek story, the Promethean god, the Titan god Prometheus, who rebelled against his older brother Zeus. So Zeus would correspond to Yahweh and Enlil. So we may have taken that fact that we were once engineered genetically to be androgynes, and then under circumstances that are so we were androgynes under circumstances that were less than ideal. So it's not representing an ideal. And when Enki decided to make us capable of procreating, we were actually becoming more like the gods. So it's not the opposite. Many people, many esotericists think that we become more like the gods when we become androgynes again, and that's not true. It's the exact opposite. And by the way, this is part of the reason supposedly that Enlil wanted to destroy mankind with a flood, because we were becoming too many. And we became too many because Enki decided we ought to be able to procreate. So the God who wants us, the so-called God who wanted to limit our numbers by creating us androgynous, is not the kind of God we would want to exactly make our ally in the struggle for progress and spiritual evolution, or biological evolution for that matter. So it's gotten fairly long. I took a while to explain all of that, and I didn't even get to the next argument I wanted to make, but I think that was some necessary background for what I will be discussing in the next few videos on the androgyne. So I'm glad we were able to get to that, because I think, as I said, I think that that's necessary background, that we should know this about this before we get too much deeper into the arguments.